All right. Thank you all for coming out and joining us this evening for Third Thursdays here at Hillyer Art Center. Oh, no, at Hillyer now, right? Sorry, the current name. I'm Jarvis DuBois, independent curator, art consultant living here in DC from the west coast of California originally. I'm really pleased to be in conversation today with Deborah Grayson, the featured artist in the third gallery here, again at Hillyer. So real quick, I'm gonna read your bio first, and then we'll get into the title of the show. Okay, we'll start there. But so Deborah Grayson is a fine art printmaker, painter, and scholar. She creates work about the interior lives of Black people and how they fully live in their lives. In her work, Grayson is interested in capturing the nuance, beauty, and dimensionality of Black lives that often gets drowned out by the necessity of always having to say truly obvious and basic things like Black Lives Matter. Kevin Kwashi tells us that there is heft and history in everyday moments. For Grayson, to reflect on these everyday moments, to recognize and relish them, provides an opportunity for more expansive ways of seeing and being. Born and raised in Washington, D.C. and Montgomery County, Maryland, go for life. She earned a BA in English Language and Literature from the University of Maryland, College Park, and an MA and PhD in American Studies from Michigan State University, where her areas of concentration were literature, history, and science. Her studio is currently located in Northeast Washington, D.C. Again, thank you, Deborah, for being in conversation with me. Thank you, Tim and Cassandra, for inviting me to join her today, and this is a great honor for me. Let's get to the title real quick, and I had to take a picture. I want to make sure I get this right. They see love as a reddening of the earth under the sun, and I love that. As a literature major, also former literature major in college, I love a good title, a long title, poetic one. So for those who may not know where that title comes from, you talk a little bit about how you came to that?
Yeah, it's from a book I read recently by Leon Ross called Poppy Show. And I think she's Jamaican Swedish woman, and she's talking about people on this fictitious island and how they find their purpose in life. And so that the line in the book comes almost at the end of the book, but it really struck me. And I was saying earlier, I rarely use red. It's just not a color that I use. And so those two things is what made me go with the title.
And so those who don't know, the title piece is the one in the middle with the two figures.
And the other thing that I would say just is, for that particular piece, I did it for two friends who recently got married, met each other later in life, had long sworn off relationships. And so it's really about just my hope for them that they have love, present, future, eternally. So
I love that. And since we're talking about that, Deborah, can you talk a little bit about the symbolism in that image?
Yeah, so I really am interested in kind of, mysticism, world religion, sacred geometry, and so that is kind of a riff on a symbol, and it's really just emphasizing or demonstrating the connection between the two people.
Oh, with the concentric circles and everything. Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you for that. Let's get into the questions I created for tonight. So, thinking about this piece and the others, when did you become interested in folklore and mythologies? And a part of that, as I'm thinking about, for me, like both interested in mythology back in grade school. I love the Greek mythology, the ancient Egyptian stories of some heroes and knights and dragons, just as an escape. Just wondering for you how you came to that as a foundation, if you will, for your art making.
Well, as I was saying, I was an English major, always loved reading, and loved Greek mythology, but I also grew up, I come from a long line of teachers and preachers and people who could tell stories. Okay. And so I'm always just really interested in the stories that people tell about their lives. And so mythology, folklore, biography, history really, has all been really interesting to me. Also, when I was an undergraduate at the University of Maryland, I had Dr. Gladys Marie Fry was my professor, is a well-known folklorist, and that was it. I just never stopped after that. So.
Thank you, yeah. And I'm thinking, and not a mythology or folklore, but thinking about cultural practice of spirituality, reverence for ancestors, some call it ancestor worship, but that sort of connection to the past, families, known or unknown, right? And thinking about in your piece, you have in a few pieces, actually the one behind us here, and then there's one there to the back wall to the right on the corner. Your inclusion of the Nkisi, those guardian figures, reliquaries. How did you come to that and decide you wanted to incorporate those into your work?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One is you mentioned in my biography, it's always weird to sit there and listen to people talk about you. But Sunday afternoons, my father and I would always go, this was before the African Art Museum was open, we would go to the National Gallery or Hirshhorn, and we would look at art. So that was one, that I would see the figures there sometimes. The second is I am a huge fan of Renee Stout, who of course works with Nkisi figures in her work and even made herself into one. And so that is what made me start to research them. From Central Africa, the figures are usually wooden. They usually have nails driven in them. There's usually a hollowed out center where you put different things in them. And the other thing that I really liked is that everyday objects were also things of beauty. So art was also, was part of daily life and practice. But the nails started really coming up in my work during COVID, because I started printmaking again in my basement because I couldn't go anywhere and I didn't want to paint in my house. And so I started looking again at what people did to survive and thrive in really difficult times. What did they use to do that? How did they manage their emotions? How did they stay connected? And so the Nkisi figures came back to me. And so they represent, depending on what you're reading or who you talk to, figures about healing, figures to kind of help drive out negative energy. And so the nails coupled with, most of my figures have closed eyes, is me. That's how I'm talking about that. That's how I'm dealing with that. And at the moment when I was making the work, I needed peace. And so that was part of how I was managing it for myself during that time.
And sort of a centering for you in these figures.
Grounding.
Sort of grounding, and then also kind of searching within and not their eyes. And so I'm really glad you said this at her artist talk this past Saturday. You talked about that, how all the figures have the eyes closed.
With the exception
for the
of
most,
that one.
exception here. Which is with a later piece, but this sort of like calling and looking to within, right, for that peace, that grounding, that centering, and not getting so distracted by the outside noise, right?
Yep.
So thinking about the way you're showing your figures, kind of archival or vintage imagery comes to mind, photography, and you talked about that in your artist talk this past weekend. When did that sort of draw you in? I know you've been lit measure, so you're going to libraries and looking at archives in a different way, right? But as far as using those images for your art making, how did you make that sort of connection?
So again, everything with me is a layer, right? So the first thing, I'm really interested in vernacular photography. And I'm probably one of the last generations where people actually bother to print the photos and put them in albums. And so I have stacks of albums from my great-grandparents and my grandparents and my parents. My sister and I have since rated them and taken all the photos and put them in other places to keep them. So those images were my first influence. I'm really fascinated by the history of places. And in addition to museums, my father and I would also go to the Archive or Library of Congress or the Washington Historical Society. And I'm really interested in looking at how a place changes over time. Okay. And so I got really interested in that. And then when I was in graduate school, a lot of my work was in, I used to teach biomedical ethics, totally different from what I do now. But so I was always encountering images, especially images about people in medical situations and how people were documented and the narratives that were constructed about people by the physicians who were seemingly treating them. And my area, my time frame that I did a lot of my work in was 1900 to 1945, so you can imagine what was in those archives.
Right, yeah.
So when I started looking at those images, I'm like, what would the story be like if the people in these images were telling the story and if they were centered in those stories? And so I continue to think about that. Then the last layer is that I cannot go to an estate sale or an antique store and pass a photo album and not buy the photos. I can't help it.
Okay.
And so there was one instance where I forget where I was, somewhere way out in Virginia, and I got this box of photos, and there was of a black family from 1900 to 1970. And so I thought, oh, I've got to have these. And then I got home and I started flipping through them, and they were from Washington, D.C. And they were right on W Street.
Oh, excellent.
And so then I was able to track down the family, because I'm like, they should have these photos. And we had an open studio. This was, I guess it was time, I don't know time anymore since the pandemic, but I think it was a couple of summers ago. And I had done a large drawing of a woman, and long story short, a relative walked in and saw it and immediately recognized the person as her family member.
From one of these photographs?
From one of the photographs.
Yeah, okay.
And so we got to talking anyway, ended up giving her all the photos. So
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Because as you were talking about like going to estate sales and buying these old, because I'm fascinated by these old vintage, you know, sepia tone photographs, like think about who are these people, right? But that you went the extra steps to track the family down. Because I think about this idea of like having images of people you don't know beyond like fine art, like on your wall, but like photo albums full of these, you know, folks are not related to you.
right.
How that,
It's unsettling in some ways.
yeah.
It's unsettling because, not to get too woo-woo, but I feel like they have an energy to them. And I often wonder, how did these photos end up in these places? How did these, you know, people lose their history in this way? There's an image that comes to mind when I was, again, doing graduate study, and one of my favorite poets is Georgia Douglas Johnson. She was a writer during the New Negro Renaissance and lived right around the corner from Howard. And she passed away probably around the same time I was born in the late 60s. And I guess the family lost the house for taxes or whatever. And there's a story in the archive where the city is cleaning out the house. All of her poetry, all of her books blowing down the street.
Wow.
And nobody, you know.
Right.
And so I'm like, not on my
No
watch.
one claiming them, no
Right.
one,
So anytime I come across it, I hoard them. And sometimes they stay in my collection, and sometimes I you know, donate them places. But it is, especially the medical photographs that I was using and looking at, it's unsettling. And I have to sit with them, though, because it's like, I feel like you have to look at them and not look away.
Sure, because I was trying to think about the right word, right adjective to use, like this, again, this our archive really of these family photographs, are very personal, and how they would wind up in an estate sale. You know, like that's something you wouldn't necessarily sell or give away, right? But you think about how they came to be in these sales, probably some terrible story.
Yeah,
you know?
probably. Or people didn't come
house
back.
foreclosed or burned down, and they could rescue out, you know, save and wind up in wherever. You know. That's great. I love that.
So I rescue the photos.
Yeah, that's great. And thinking about kind of a segue, thinking about the fraught, maybe, you know, way that these images wind up, you know, at estate sales and what have you, or flea market or whatever. Thinking about, and we talked about this a bit, and it was really enlightening for me to think about, for me, the fraught symbolism of cotton. And I was sitting here during the talk, I'm like, I have to ask her about that, right? Because for a lot of Black Americans, right?
Trust me, people have yelled at me about it, so.
Yeah, no, I get it. And I definitely didn't want to yell, but I was like, this, you know, use of that imagery, because it's very fraught in our history here, and one of violence typically, and subjugation and toil and, you know, destruction really of, you know, family, emotionally, spiritually, physically, right? So we talked about this claiming or reclaiming of the symbol of cotton, right? In your art. Could you talk more about that, for us? How you're using it and in this different kind of almost a different kind of world building in a way, I think.
I mean, I'm still thinking about the conversation that we had last Saturday about claiming and reclaiming. I don't think about it in those terms. I'm really interested in holding multiple complex stories at the same time.
Okay.
And I think multiple things can be true at the same time.
Right.
So definitely the history in the United States or in the Americas of cotton has all that stuff that you're talking about, trauma, et cetera, forced labor. But in my origin story, in my family, it's also about land ownership and what we grew there, and that even in that context of enslavement and forced labor, we had plots of land and we grew things that sustained our families.
Right.
And so it's a both and to me, the full arc of the narrative of African American history is not trauma. It's a significant part, but that is not the full story.
Right.
And so my point is always, even in that, we lived, we loved, we laughed. Right. And again, doesn't erase all that other stuff, but there's this piece. And what does the narrative look like when we're at the center of the story? And so it's about telling the story, not always reacting, but being. Yeah. So that's what that's about.
And and this placement of the figures right in the cotton bolls there, right? They're surrounded by it.
So
right?
It's soft, it's thorny, there are all these kind of nuances and juxtapositions.
Right. Yeah. It pricked the hands. It was painful, but also nurturing.
Yep.
Like you said, sustaining, right?
The fabric of our lives, right?
Right. I think, literally clothe people, right? Yeah. Right. Yes, and the one back here, the audience could turn to the very back of the room. She has this almost crown of the cotton, you know what I mean? So, and again, eyes closed, she's at peace, she's steadfast, and just owning that.
The whole thing.
Her own agency
the whole
in a way,
thing.
right,
Yeah.
all of that. But it's definitely, I like that both and. It's complicated, it's nuanced.
There's nothing about our history that isn't.
Right.
So.
Throughout history, right? Particularly in this country, I think. And so you talked about your land ownership of your family and this commodity sustaining it, right? And it makes me think about an artist friend of mine who lives right here in DC. Her father was a sharecropper of cotton up until the 70s.
Wow.
Which blew my mind. I had no idea. In the South, South Carolina. And I was like, in the 70s, this was still happening, And I believe he still owns that land, he still lives down there. So I just thought about that just now as you were talking about your family. Last question I have, and we can definitely open up to questions for the audience, is what you have planned for the future. How do you see, we talked a little bit about this on Saturday. Yeah. How do you see, I think I asked the question before your talk ended actually, right? Before we got to talk privately, but how you see your work expanding? What would you like to see? Is that a variety of mediums, compositions, experimentation with scale? How do you see it kind of moving out?
Yeah, so definitely staying within printmaking. There's so many processes within it. I could play with it forever. I see this series as chapters. And so the first chapter, which I exhibited a lot last year, is all black and white because I was doing it during COVID and I saw like a field. It was just starkness. And then these three pieces here were the transition pieces. It's all the same color, but I've just played with the ink because I never use the color right out of the can. But these are sepia. And then from there, I started transitioning to color. It went from there to there, and then as you see, it progressively gets brighter. And this was the last piece that I did. So the next chapter actually goes more deeply into botany, ethnobotany in particular, plant life. Cotton may still appear, but I'm really interested in like those plants that we brought with us and how they show up in American cuisine and African American cuisine. But I'm more interested in the plants and how they were used for healing. So it's kind of a variation on some of the theme that you see here. So right now I'm just drawing plants and studying roots, and when I research something, I usually completely lose my mind. And so what happened was I have now built 6 raised beds in my backyard, and I'm growing the plants myself, and I'm plucking them out of the ground and drawing them and looking at them. So yeah, my father's like, yeah, you lost it.
So it's sort of like a part of your art making, but also feeding yourself, right? Are you?
Well, yeah, I'm gonna eat it.
Yeah, so after you have it, so I love that.
It's sustainable.
Dual service.
And it appeals to my art and science brain too.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Great. And okay, I like that. I'm thinking too. I wanted to start with this for the audience, but thinking about for you all, we can wrap with this before we get to the questions. Think about a story you heard from your family or you read. Could it be a myth, folklore that's impacted your life in some way? That's informed how you are. You know, good or bad, but hopefully something that's impacted it positively. And like I said, I wanted to start the conversation with that, to kind of think about that while we're hearing about your family connections and stories. And I think about my own today, like my grandmother's stories and her leaving too soon. Like I wish I would have learned more from her before she passed on it. I was 16, it's a long time ago. But just think about some moment in your lives where you had heard a story or something from a family member or even something you read that has really imparted some sort of wisdom upon yourself. And you don't have to, if you like to share with us, you can, but just think about it. I want to leave you with that before we get into question part. So anyone?
So I wasn't necessarily thinking about Christianity when I did that, but clearly there are some connections that you can make, yeah. And then some folks have, I guess the word I would use is projected onto what I was doing to, I've had people accuse me of being demonic, which I think is interesting. And I'm like, that's more about how you think and not what I was doing. But that's interesting, but no, that's not what I was thinking. But I definitely think you can make connections there. And I think it's all meshed in my head. I wasn't setting out to do that though, so. Yeah, I don't know if I would add anything to what you said. I let other people put that kind of stuff on the work. I don't worry about it. I tell the story that I feel like I need to tell. I'm interested in talking about it later as people see connections or bring things to the work maybe I hadn't intended or thought about, but that's the point to me of making the work, right? And I was saying to Tim earlier, I mean, it doesn't bother me to do artist talks, but they always feel weird to me because I feel like I said what I wanted to say, But I do it, I show up anyway, and people say things like what you just said, which are really interested, yeah. But I mean, I don't know, is visual art the only art form where people feel like they need an interpreter? I mean, do we have people explaining music to us? Maybe we do, I don't know. But yeah, anyway.
I think your work is beautiful, and it doesn't require an explanation, but it makes me, I see it and I want to learn more.
Yeah.
I mean, whatever it is,
fair.
your process or what you were thinking, it's all just really fascinating to me. So, but I agree with you. I don't think art should need an interpretation.
Right.
It's how you perceive it, right?
I mean,
as a viewer.
Everybody brings something to it.
I think that's the fun of it, though. Yeah. I love that. Okay. There's the answer.
Well, I'm wondering though, to that though, Deborah, do you feel what you said earlier about someone came and saw this piece, we talked about this on Saturday too, as demonic, right? Satanic in some way, because it's a heart with the nails.
But that wasn't about me or the work, that was about them.
Well, no, right. But I'm wondering though, definitely about the work, what they're seeing, right? But do you feel at those times when you hear that, compelled then to explain, yes, that's not what it is. This is about Nikisi, traditional Congo, art from the Congo. But no, not so much?
So the one thing that I hope is that I evoke something in people. Clearly, that brought up some stuff for that individual. I am at a point in my life, I don't feel like I have to explain anything or justify anything. And so I listened, although it's interesting to me in the last 3 to 4 years, and I think I'm experiencing this with a lot of folks. I have a lower threshold of patience for
Yeah.
people who have super narrow views.
Okay. Mhm.
And so I was only able to tolerate that conversation for so long, and I'm just like, that's what you see.
You sit there.
I'm
and-
done.
Yeah, right,
You
right,
know,
right. Okay.
I wasn't going to debate her or
Yeah.
argue with her, and she wasn't going to convert me. So
Sure,
yeah.
sure. Because she's projecting her
Well, I
own
mean, and that's, I think we
possibility
all
of
do
yeah.
that. That's fine, but it just kind of was a little aggressive.
Yeah, okay.
So yeah.
Understood.
Yeah.
Any other questions for me? Hi.
I love vernacular photographs or family photos, how people take images of themselves and what people choose to photograph and how they choose to be photographed. It says a lot. There's a lot in that story. And so I'm fascinated by that. I mean, even looking at my own family pictures, you know, my parents are of a generation where you still dressed when you went out. And so my father was always clean, his shoes, creases sharp, you know. And so I just love that look. Or even, you know, my grandfather and his brothers and my grandmother, I just loved that look. Even if there was like a family dinner or cookout, folks were dressed. They were dressed well, and there was always music cranked, you know. And when I was a little girl, I would kind of be the DJ and play albums so that the adults could keep talking. And I would always have to stay focused so I didn't laugh, so they would remember that I was there when I was listening to stuff I probably had no business listening to, or just being in adult spaces when I probably should have been off with the other kids. But anyway, all of that, the stories that I heard from my grandparents, and like you, and I had my grandmother for a long time. She lived to be like 95. But even with that, I still wished I had paid more attention or really understood what she was giving me at the time. So I soaked up a lot of it, but there are other things I'm like, oh, I wish I really understood better, I listened better. So it's my deep interest in people's stories and their biographies. Why did they do the things that they did? How did they overcome the things that they encountered? How did they live their lives in the midst of tough times, you know, war and segregation, all those things. But it really just got me, again, my own family photos, other family photos just really got me interested in how people saw themselves. The other piece, my master's, I was focused on 19th century literature, but I had to quickly not do that anymore. But it's something like Frederick Douglass was the most photographed man of his. Yeah, and so, and it would tickle me because he was always posing, you know, but this was how he created the narrative about himself, right? And what did he write, like 4 or 5 biographies of himself? And each time the story got more intense and elaborate. And so that was really interesting, you know, Sojourner Truth and even Phyllis Wheatley, the first image of her was a woodcut, right? And what is the woodcut image of? It's her thinking and writing in the 18th century. And so photography has always been a way that we've figured out a way to fashion ourselves and tell our stories. So that's what that interest is. And then the other part, as I was saying, was just the medical narratives and the images, because photography is coming into being at the same time racialized science is happening. And often the photographs were used to justify the crazy scientific narratives that were being told. And so one of the research projects I was working on just before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and then for my own mental health, I had to cut it off for a while. I've been doing this research on 19th and early 20th century mental hospitals for the colored insane. And so they were all through the South. It was at Crownsville in Maryland, Searcy in Alabama, Central in Georgia, Cherry Hill in North Carolina. So I was looking at Cherry Hill specifically, and I was working on a community archive project with folks in North Carolina between Duke and Chapel Hill, and then some artists, musicians, and archivists. And as with a lot of stories about African Americans, we were in the downstairs in the basement of the hospital and turn around and there's a shelf in the corner with boxes of images. And these images were of the Black patients at the hospital, along with papers and everything, and this physician's documentation. I mean, to read the narrative was wild, and I'm like, wow, he was treating these people, and this is what he thought. But then again, the photographs of the people were really painful, but also fascinating, and I just felt compelled to sit with them. And so they appear in some of my work. I'm not gonna really say where, but they do appear in my work. And again, it's this imagining what would happen if they were able to live the lives that they were entitled to during that time, and what the story would be if they were telling it. So that's part of where all that comes from. It's weird. Yeah, I usually have a kernel of an idea. This comes from even when I was more doing scholarly stuff. I could write and write and write, but it didn't click for me until the right title came. And so sometimes in the back of my sketchbooks, I usually write words that jump out at me, phrases that jump out at me, titles, even before I have a piece. And so sometimes they get matched up there, and sometimes I'm doing the work and I'm like, oh, it's this. So like high cotton, I think is an expression, a colloquialism. I forget, it was something that was popular in the 30s and 40s, but it was also the name of a book by Daryl Pinckney. And so that popped up for me. And then Still Amidst the Cotton, which is that one, that came to me quickly after that. I told you about this one. Ahoskie is on the other side of Harlem. It's just a reflection of my own narrative because my maternal side is from Ahoskie, North Carolina. And you know, a chunk of my family migrated up to Harlem, but a chunk stayed here in DC. And so that's kind of a mash of my mother's story and my story in that one. I think this was a jazz title. This is Softly as the Morning Comes. I think it's a Diane Reeves song. And then this one, I was listening to NPR and someone was being interviewed, and I don't remember what the interview was about, but she talked about past life premonitions, and I thought, oh, that's perfect for this. So that's how that got there. So it just depends. Oh, sure. I'm inspired by so many people, but I'm especially inspired by those artists, especially the 30s and 40s. And so Doc Thrash is well known for inventing, it's carborundum. It's a printmaking, it's like gritty surface that provides really dark images in printmaking. But yeah, so Doc Thrash, Margaret Burroughs is kind of my foremother, and of course Elizabeth Catlett, we all claim, of course. David Driscoll, who's a professor of mine at Maryland. Oh gosh, Curly Holton, LaToya Hobbs, who's a peer of mine. Yeah, there's so many people. I think printmaking is fascinating. I love the science of it, I love the art of it. I love that even all the things you plan to do, you still get a surprise when you pull that print. You have no idea what you're gonna get. And a friend of mine, because I used to get so frustrated, she said, Deborah, if you would stop trying to control it, you would be happier. And so I just learned, you know, it's a revelation every time I pull up that piece of paper of what I get. It's always different. Yeah,
surprise,
so, yeah, I love it. Yeah.
Any other questions? No? All right, are we get on time? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all for coming out
Thank
tonight.
you.
Thank you. Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you.